This month, I'm thrilled to have Aaron Samuels on the podcast. Aaron has many identities, and what I've always appreciated is how he brings them all with him everywhere he goes. With his firm, Collide Capital, he's on his latest mission, and we're going to get into that today. By the way, if you didn't get to listen to the recent update, we'll be moving to a first Monday release schedule for the big episodes each month. In between, I'll share some storytime episodes from one of my homes on the mic at Grown Folk Stories, where I've met Binky, Taylor, and it's also going to be discussed with some guests in future episodes. All right, let's get into it. Today on the podcast, I'm bringing you more family, not blood, but someone I've really been inspired by over the time that I've known him. I want to welcome Aaron to the podcast. Aaron, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Aaron, can you start by introducing yourself to people listening? I know this could probably take up a whole podcast on its own, but let's try our best.
No, I'll give the short version and we can get into more of it later. My name's Aaron Samuels. I'm Black, I'm Jewish, I'm a poet, founder, now venture capitalist. I grew up in Rhode Island, undergrad at WashU, grad school at Stanford, worked at Bain & Company. It's where we met before moseying my way into the startup world and ultimately becoming a venture capitalist.
Now, we're going to get into it a little bit later, but you mentioned the startup world. And one of the startups that really blew my mind, because I remember some of the early conversations we had about it, was Blavity. And it will come up later, but I want to set the stage by explaining to people a little bit about what Blavity is, if they're not familiar with it.
Yeah, of course. I'm one of the founders of Blavity. Blavity is a technology media company focused on Black millennials and Gen Z. The vision was pretty simple. We wrote it on the wall. Vision is a world where all Black people are happy. And everything that we do is oriented towards that ultimate end goal. We believe that a world where all Black people are happy is a better world for everybody.
Aaron, when we first talked about Blavity, I think I saw one of the media decks in the early days, but the numbers in there were astounding. For people who haven't visited the platform, how big is the Blavity community today versus where it was when you and I first talked about it many, many years ago?
Yeah, well, I mean, it started as four friends from undergrad. And I think when the first kind of media deck I showed you was probably a couple years in, we were reaching about 1 million people per month. These days, we're reaching anywhere between 200 and 300 million people per month, making us if not one of the largest Black media companies in the world. Let's see, we also have in-person event series. Our biggest one is a conference called Afrotech.
Mm-hmm.
This past year at Afrotech, we had it in Houston, Texas, and we had about 37,000 people there in person. So I think that makes us you can fact check this, but according to the head of the NAACP who kicked off our opening keynote, he said that made us the second largest gathering of Black people in the United States, second to the Essence Music Festival.
That is absolutely incredible. We'll talk more about Blavity in a second, and you alluded to it in your introduction, but how would you say we know each other?
I mean, I think our relationship started out as a mentor one, and to be clear, with Keith mentoring me for those listening, and I think then we became friends over the years. I think that those of us that are creative at heart but find ourselves in the business world end up gravitating towards one another, and I think you immediately saw that in me. I think even before I knew those qualities about you.
Yeah, no doubt. And I was trying to remember when we first met, because I realized when we were preparing for this, you never actually worked in the Chicago office. So we must have been paired up through like the mentoring program for Black at Bain. And I remember you were coming through Chicago on your externship, which maybe now you're past the statute of limitations. Let's be honest. It was you did a book tour and somehow roped another organization into the front for it. But you did a poetry reading of your book at an event here in Chicago in like somebody's home, if I recall. And as a photographer,
Yeah.
I was like, well, I want to be there. And the night was awesome, like the community and the other poets and the reading. And I was just really glad I got to see you in a totally different light. And from there, I just feel like I've enjoyed watching your journey from a distance. So thank you for coming on today. As I said at the beginning, you've been one of the people that inspires me with all of the different things you have going on. And I'm eager to get into one aspect of it on this episode.
Well, no, I appreciate that. And you took some great shots that night. So I appreciate you being there as well, because some of those pictures have lived on.
Aaron, one of the things I like to ask everyone on the podcast is what was their first exposure to home? In this case, investing, or as I was jokingly saying, being in the Shark Tank. When did you first see this part of the business world?
Well, I think most founders will tell you something like this, which is when you found a company, you're investing. You're investing your time.
Hmm.
That's sweat equity. I think I've been a founder since before I knew the word.
Hmm.
I've been starting initiatives and projects, since I was in middle school. But Blavity was my first real go of it
Right.
at a large scale. In that moment, I mean, this was after I'd left Bain. I had a lot of opportunities.
Hmm.
Um, could have invested my time in many different ways, but I realized that Blavity was where I wanted to put that energy.
And when you're investing your own time, I know Blavity was raising money as well, but when did you decide that this was going to be your home and what you're doing right now with Collide Capital, where you're doing it, you're living, breathing, investing and the startup world? When did you decide that was going to be home for you?
Yeah, it's one of those weird things that the decision isn't linear. It's more like you wake up one day and you find that you've been living this life for a while now. And so I think, with Blavity, we created the tech platform and the media platform, and then we acquired a couple brands. We built Afrotech, we built the conference. And then at a certain point in time, I became a visible founder, especially in the Black community and in
That's right.
communities of color. So folks that were starting companies started reaching out to me.
Hmm.
First, just asking for advice.
Right.
Hey, how did you do this? How did you make your first hire? How did you build a sales team? Then it became advice for fundraising. Hey, how do you meet investors? How do you talk to them?
Right.
And then pretty soon, I'm having very regular conversations with founders and seeing them build incredible companies with really strong ideas. So then I started investing in some of those and making angel investments and looking for opportunities to support them. And then, you wake up one day and suddenly you've done 10 or 15 angel investments. And I think I just realized that that was actually one of the favorite parts of my job.
Right.
And suddenly that is where my energy was coming from. And I realized that I actually needed to formalize that before I spent all my time talking to people that were outside of my company and not enough time actually running the organization.
Now, I know this is an audio only podcast and people can't see, but you are lighting up as you talk about that journey. And I've been to Afrotech a couple times, including the virtual one during COVID. And I will say the community that you've built through Blavity, which I viewed as an online community until I went to Afrotech with 20,000 plus at the time in Austin. And I went to one in the Bay Area and I went to the ones online. The community is truly phenomenal. And so you've really built something special that I think a lot of people are calling home, which is really awesome.
Yeah, thank you. The labor of love. I mean, the entire team has worked really hard over the past decade to build something that we felt represented us. I mean, it came after our experience in college, seeing community manifest at lunch tables or
Yeah.
in the dining hall. We gathered together and we called that Black gravity. It's Black people moving towards one another. And when we got out of college, we said we wanted to create that exact same sensation, that exact same feeling that we had as undergrads, which is in the broader tech world. And so we want that feeling. We want when you come to one of our conferences or you go to one of our websites, we want you to feel that exact same way that you felt when you found yourself at the Black table at college and immediately felt a sense of safety, felt a sense of home.
Black gravity and Blavity. I don't know why I never put those two together. So thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Aaron, I want to talk about the work you're doing in the venture capital and founder space. It's not a space most people usually associate with being special, unless they define special as making money. And you said you were surprised when I shared the idea with you about coming on, because you don't really think about it as home or special. It's just sort of what you're wired to do. And I'm like, yeah, that's exactly what we're looking for on the podcast. As we talked about the idea and the concept and what you're up to, I was even more convinced that we should have you on to talk about why your home in the investing space and in the startup ecosystem is special to you. Where should we start? What's special to you about what you're doing right now?
Yeah, no, and I have to admit, I was a bit apprehensive about it. I don't identify as my home being in the investing world, no more than I identify my home as being in the startup world. But my home is oftentimes somehow oriented around somebody telling a story and somebody listening to that story.
Mm-hmm.
When you were talking about the idea for the podcast, I immediately went back to my roots. I grew up in the poetry community and specifically in the poetry slam. And
Mm-hmm.
when I was remembering most of my formative moments as a young person, it involved me either being on stage performing and somebody listening to that poetry performance and judging me, or it involved me being in the audience, listening to somebody else make a presentation or share a poem, and me judging them. And I realized that it's very similar when I think about the work that I did as a founder. I remember the first time I was part of an accelerator program. I was part of 500 startups. I remember they were talking about this big demo day at the end of the 10-week boot camp. You do a 5-minute presentation in front of a room of 100 people to try to convince them to invest in your company. And they said it was 5 minutes and you only had 10 slides. And I was listening to this saying, I get 5 whole minutes and I get to use slides. This is nothing. In the poetry slam, you only get 3 minutes, and after 10 seconds over, you start getting time penalties. And so it was just, and I realized, I was like, oh, a pitch is a poem. Now, I'm sure there's some poets that'll chastise me for that. The reality is, of course, with poetry, you are operating with a much wider spectrum of emotions that you're trying to capture. But the essence of it is very similar. You are starting a company. You have a new idea that you are trying to share with the world. You have a limited amount of time to convince somebody that your idea has value, that your idea has merit. And I think a poem at its essence is a translation vehicle from writer to reader, writer to listener, to translate an emotion or a series of emotions. Yeah, when I look at it that way, of course I'm at home in the pitch. Of course I'm at home in the story. Of course I'm at home in listening to it.
It sounds like the skills, the environment, the community, the elements are the same. The context might have changed, but it's the same Aaron doing the same types of things.
Yeah, and maybe people are listening for different things as well. But yeah, I believe that the most charismatic founders are doing something very similar to what the most charismatic performance artists are doing.
Now, it sounds like a lot of what you're doing today, then, you've been doing since your early days in high school. How does the process stay the same? Both the creative process, the delivery process, the judging and evaluation process. I want to pull out some more of the parallels because I think people are going, poetry and pitching a business? What? What are you talking about?
Well, there's a few concepts, that you learn about in poetry. One concept that I think is really important is called economy of language. And when you are writing poetry, a lot of the work is in the edit, is in really sculpting down, figuring out, okay, what is the fastest way to communicate this? It's not the only concept in poetry, of course, and there's epic poems as well. But I think that economy of language is incredibly important when you live in a world with short attention spans and people are being inundated with lots of different ideas and information. If you can get your idea across in a pithy way, it matters. I think another concept that matters a lot is what I call, and this is specifically from the poetry world, what I call the balance between content and performance. So the balance between substances and performance. When you're competing in poetry slam, you're effectively being judged on both. Like, what is the quality of your writing, as well as how are you performing it? And, investors don't want this to be true. We like to think that we're objective and that we're only judging a business based on the hard numbers and the metrics, but it's not true. And I think that if a founder can present their idea in a persuasive way, it matters. And it doesn't only matter to the investor themselves, but the investor is also listening to that founder and asking themselves, do I think they're going to be able to sell this product? Do I believe that they will use this to be able to get revenue? If the founder can't convince an investor, how are they going to convince a potential customer? And so you're always kind of listening for those correlations.
It sounds like you've been doing this a long time, but you're listening to people pitch their ideas to you and ideas that they're hugely invested in. You're also on the other side of the venture capital space, asking people to invest in your fund and write you checks that are pretty large and life-changing. Is that intimidating for you or scary, being in front of an audience, being the person that all eyes are focused on and needing to be at your best, both in terms of substance and style?
I appreciate that. I've been doing this for a long time. I remember I was in business school and I was doing a presentation for one of my classes, and it wasn't a super important presentation, but it was the first one. 100 people in the class, and I stood up, I did my presentation, I walked off, and I remember the professor coming up to me saying, "That was one of the best presentations I've ever seen in my business school class." I don't even remember what it was about. It was so non-consequential to me. And he looked at me and he said, "Have you done this before? Like, have you done public speaking?" And I just immediately flashed back to, the first big stage I was on. I was 14 years old performing at the Apollo Theater, or I was, 17 years old performing at the Smithsonian, or I was in my early 20s performing on national television. And I realized that, yeah, by the time I did that business school presentation, I'd been on hundreds of stages filled with very scary and very intimidating
Right.
people. So that's not to say that I don't sometimes get scared. You never know what stage you're going to be on or who's going to be judging you, but I have a lot of reps. I think that's important at this stage in my life. You described it as, I have to pitch to some LPs, some limited partners to get them to invest in my fund. I'm also listening to founders pitch me to potentially invest in their business. And I'm also supporting and training my founders when they go out and pitch other investors. And so most of my life is some form of I'm pitching, I'm receiving pitching, or I'm coaching pitches, which if you asked me at age 18 or age 16, hey Aaron, when you're a grown up, are you going to be a venture capitalist? I would have looked at you like you had two heads. But I said, what's a venture capitalist? But if you said, hey Aaron, when you grow up, do you think you'll spend most of your time doing performances, evaluating performances, and coaching performances? I would have said, well, yeah, that's exactly what I do right now. Because 16-year-old Aaron, that's literally all I spent my time doing. It was just in poetry.
Aaron, I've met a lot of investors over the years, including many in the VC and angel space that invest in early stage companies, as founders are really trying to grow and prove their concept. And founders can be pretty particular about who they take money from. Sometimes they're desperate, a lot of times they're not. I know that you take that responsibility very seriously. It's not just an investment in something on a spreadsheet. But I wanted to talk about that because I have to believe there's something special to you about the people you invest in because you're effectively choosing to spend a lot of your time with them in one way, shape, or form.
Yeah, spend a lot of my time and gamble my financial future on what they do. So, look, I'm an investor, so of course there's lots of things I look for that all investors look for. You look at unit economics and market size and traction, but in addition to all of the fundamental stuff,
Mm-hmm.
personally, I look for a particular type of founder. What I look for is a founder who believes that they have found a hole in the universe where they are uniquely able to fill. And now maybe that's because they're the only one that sees the hole. Maybe it's because they're the only one that cares about it. Maybe it's because they've been wrestling with this hole, with this problem for their entire life or for generations in their family.
Mm-hmm.
But for some reason, they're uniquely qualified to fill this hole. And as a result, they're not going to stop
Right.
until they've done it.
It's like the superhero in a movie where they can't let it go. They've just
They
gotta
can't let it
they've
go.
just gotta
They can't
go
let it
for it.
go.
They're on this
And that's
mission
what's
from day one.
required. Exactly. Look, the numbers aren't great. They change every year, but they fluctuate around the same marks, which is about 3% of startups succeed.
Mm-hmm.
Of venture-backed startups, I'm sure even more fail. They
Right.
don't have, but about 3% of venture-backed startups succeed. So said differently, 97% of venture-backed startups will fail, and the typical timeline to exit for a startup is somewhere between 7 and 12 years.
Right. So you
And
don't even
so,
know.
yeah, I mean, this is not an endeavor that sane people embark upon. You have a 97% chance of failure, and in the event that you succeed, it will take you 12 years to find out if you're in the good 3%. You can't do it for the money. It can't be about the money. It needs to be about something deeper than that. So that's the thing that I look for.
So Aaron, how are you identifying that in people? Everybody sort of comes in with swagger, presumably, and everybody comes in thinking they're the one. It's sort of like, hoop dreams. All those middle school kids who are positive they're going to go to the NBA one day. How are you finding the 3% that can actually pull this off?
There's a few different signals that you can look for. One thing that I look for is have they been wrestling with this problem before? Have they been wrestling with this problem in some other way? And I think about, when I was creating Blavity with, Morgan, Jeff, and Jonathan, if investors ask themselves that question about us, have you been working on technology solutions to make the Black community a better place? all of us would have a huge resume doing that. In fact,
Right.
doing it together as undergrads, that's where we
Right.
first
Right.
all met and we're building together. And so by the time we went out and decided to found a company, it wasn't, it was the first company that I had created. It was actually with Morgan and Jeff, I think it was their third company, but it was the first company that I had created. But it wasn't the first time I'd created something to try to solve that problem.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't the first time I'd wrestled with this issue of connectivity among Black millennials and Black Gen Z. And so I look for something similar. Have you done it? And maybe you did it at your last job. Maybe you did it when you were in school. Maybe you studied the issue. Maybe you haven't built anything about it, but maybe you've been writing about it. Maybe you have a blog where you've been wrestling with the problem, the concept. But I want to see that you didn't just start thinking about this issue yesterday.
It's been bugging you for a long time, and you're finally ready to scratch the hell out of that itch.
Exactly.
Aaron, on the other side of the equation is your investors. We've talked a little bit about the founders that you're investing in, but you also have people investing in you, and they're trusting you
Yes.
with a lot of money and a lot of resources. At some level, you take the money you can get. I understand that. However, are there some investors or some aspect of finding those partners that's special to you beyond just, they can write you the check and enable you to do the work that you're doing?
Absolutely. And we think a lot about who we are trying to make money for.
Mm-hmm.
The wealth gap is a complicated concept, but it doesn't change if the same people keep making money and the same people don't keep making money. And I'm very proud that our anchor investor for the fund, both in Fund 1 and in our upcoming Fund 2, is the University of California Unified Endowment. So
Mm-hmm.
this is UC Regents that runs the endowment for all of the UC schools.
Wow.
And when we make money in our fund, that goes to the UC. It helps pay for teachers, for faculty, for school administrators. And these are schools that affect an incredibly large number of the California population. And we're not just talking about UC Berkeley and UCLA. We're also talking about schools like UC Merced and UC Davis and UC Riverside. These are schools that cater to a large percentage of the California college age population. And we're honored to have the privilege to be investing money on their behalf.
Right. And are you engaging with them beyond just being an investment vehicle for them? Are you engaged in the UC system in other ways?
Absolutely. I think that we don't have this relationship with all of our LPs.
Sure.
For some of our LPs, including the UC, it's more than just a financial arrangement. It's a partnership. We've gone out to investor days and to pitch competitions at multiple different UC schools. Mm-hmm. We've presented in front of the regents. We've had conversations with potential interns from UC schools. We've hired several interns from the UC schools, and actually multiple of them have converted to full-time hires at Collide Capital. And so it's not just about money. It's talent, it's pipeline, and it's opportunity to meet the next generation of founders as well that are coming out of the UC system.
Aaron, what strikes me as you're describing this, and again, you talked about 16-year-old you, and I'm thinking about 22-year-old you when I met you coming out of school. It just feels like you do a fantastic job of building a community of like-minded people that want to be together and want to do great work together at every stop. And this feels like it's just another stop on the journey you've been on for decades at this point.
Well, look, community is something that you can create without money and without power. And I think it's one of the reasons that the concept of community permeates so deeply through underrepresented demographic groups. And so I think that at a young age, I realized that if I could give back to the communities that nurtured me, then it would create a positive cycle. And so I apply those same philosophies, that same mindset to the work we do here. And I think you can be a good venture capitalist and not have these strong communities that you build. But I think most of the great venture capitalists and most of the great startup founders, they're all doing the same thing. They are building partnerships and they are building community that spans much, much further than a simple financial or transactional relationship.
Aaron, as we start to wrap up, I wanted to get a little bit more personal. I've known you a long time and know you can pretty much do anything that you want to do. You're one of those people who has a lot of different outlets and a lot of different places that you could call home. And I see what you're doing with Collide Capital, and I know this is personal for you, and we've just spent some time talking about that. But I also feel like there's part of your origin story in the business world that makes what you're doing at Collide really special for you, given some of the other experiences that you had. Am I reading too much into that, or making something up that's not really there?
No, no, I don't think so. I think one of my mentors growing up said, you organize where you're at. When I was younger, my perspective was different.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was 14 and I had no money, I had no power, and I had very limited skills, what I had was my voice and what I had was my story. And that's what put me on stages. And as I got older, I realized that maybe my voice and my story was important and powerful. But if I could create a platform that amplified the stories of my generation, that was even more powerful. And that's where really Blavity came from. It
Mm-hmm.
started as a platform for amplification, not just one story, but many stories. And I
Right.
think over 10 years at Blavity, what started as building a platform for storytelling ultimately became a company.
Mm-hmm.
And I started realizing that in company building, we were able, as four 25-year-olds, raising, just a $6.5 million Series A, were able to create a platform that reached hundreds of millions of people. And then I started asking myself, what could be possible if there wasn't just one Blavity, but if there could be 100 Blavities? And so again, my perspective shifted as I got a little bit older. And in the same way that I went from telling my own story and looking at one voice to building a platform for voices, I started asking myself, instead of building one company, could I build a platform for creating companies? And I think that that's logically how I arrived at venture capital as a means to, significantly scale the impact.
Were there lessons or experiences on the journey that you had with Blavity and other initiatives that are shaping the way you think about engaging with founders? I have to believe that for Black 25-year-olds with, I'll say, limited business experience at that age, raising seven figures was hard, but probably not as hard as it might be for some other demographics and some other people that would be looking for money. Does that shape how you approach things today?
Absolutely, absolutely. And so, I'll say one note on that is, we were four Black people that were raising money for this company, but we also had a lot of privileges going for us. We were educated at WashU. We had experience in the tech world.
Mm-hmm.
We had strong resumes. We had mentors, and it was still very difficult for us to do it.
Right. You had everything you could want starting on the journey, and it was still uphill both ways.
Correct. But when we would joke with each other that if we had just one less of those, notches of privilege, we don't get there. Right. It took all of that privilege just to overcome the fact that at the end of the day, we were a team of Black people that was building a company for the benefit of Black people.
Right.
And, that wasn't something that a lot of people wanted to back. Enough people wanted to back it that we were able to be successful and then prove the point out. But I say that to say that I've learned as an investor that everybody that I talk to is approaching me with some combination of privilege and oppression. Mm-hmm. Everybody exists on that matrix. People have, regardless of what it is, whether maybe you didn't go to a target school, or, maybe it's the color of your skin, or maybe it's your sexual orientation, or maybe it's your experience in the military. And everybody's coming with some different kind of background. And for some reason, certain subsets of that background make it so that some people don't get looked at. And I think that can create opportunities. I think it can create opportunities to find founders that are existing in communities where other people aren't looking. And sometimes that can lead to opportunities.
Aaron, as we close up, I just wanted to give people a chance to learn a little bit more about you and see a little bit of what we talked about. I'll include a link to Blavity in the show notes, and people can just go to it, blavity.com. What else should they check if they want to learn a little bit more about you and the work that you're doing, both in venture capital and otherwise? Because you're just one of those interesting people should know about.
Thank you. I appreciate that. You can definitely check out Collide Capital. Check us out on our website as well as Instagram and LinkedIn. Personally, you can check out my poetry. I have a couple books that you can find on Amazon, your local bookstores, as well as poetry that's in some journals. And I think the thing that I'm working on mostly these days is supporting founders. And so if you are a founder that has found an idea that can plug a hole in the universe that only you can do, reach out to me. I'd love to have a conversation.
Aaron, I want to thank you for coming on today. I know you are crazy busy, and it's always good to talk to, like I said at the top, family and reconnect, even if we're being recorded and catching up live in front of lots of people.
I appreciate you having me.
Thanks for listening to this episode of My Home is Special. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast to get future episodes automatically. You can go to myhomeisspecial.com to see the full project and sign up for email updates. Be sure to follow KBevPhoto on Instagram or go to kbevphoto.com to see what I'm snapping these days. There's a lot on both to explore. For now, this is Keith, aka KBev, signing off. Peace.